Pick up a handful of sand from any beach on Earth, hold it in your palm, and study it closely. Really look at it. The official explanation says that what you are holding is the result of millions of years of geological process, rock broken down by water and wind and time into the finest possible particles, carried by rivers and oceans, then laid down along shorelines across the planet. That is the story most people have been taught since the first time they ever asked what sand is made of. But ask a different question. What if sand is not the product of geological time at all? What if it is the product of something that happened once, recently in geological terms, and happened everywhere at the same time? What if the sand on every beach on Earth is the same substance because it came from the same event? And what if that event, the most destructive and transformative event in the history of this planet, within the span of human memory, was the very thing that reset civilization, erased what existed before, and left behind the raw material from which the world we see today was built? That claim, that the sand on every beach is sawdust, compressed and processed organic debris from a planetary-scale forest destroyed in one catastrophic episode, is one of the most radical interpretations in the entire Tartarian research community. But really, when you begin to examine the evidence it draws on, it also becomes one of the most internally consistent, not because it has been proven, not because the case is settled, but because the questions it forces you to ask about standard geological and botanical explanations lead to places those explanations do not comfortably go. Today, that is where the investigation begins. We are going to look at what sand actually is. We are going to look at the gaps in the geological consensus that rarely get discussed in public-facing science. We are going to examine what silica is, where it appears in the world, and why the relationship between biological silica and geological silica is far more complicated than most people realize. We are going to examine what the proponents of the mud, flood, and world reset theory would believe happened to the forests, and why the photographic record of the 19th century contains anomalies that, in their view, help explain those claims. And we are going to start with the sand itself. Silicon dioxide, or silica, is the most abundant mineral compound in the crust of the Earth. It makes up roughly 60% of the Earth's continental crust by mass. It is the primary component of granite, of quartz, of sandstone. It appears in virtually every geological formation on the planet in significant quantities. The standard geological account says that silicon and oxygen, the two most abundant elements in the Earth's crust, combined under the pressure and temperature conditions of early planetary formation to produce silica. That silica then crystallized, sorted, and differentiated over billions of years into the many silicate minerals that make up the geological record. In that account, sand is simply very small silica, mostly quartz, along with other silicate minerals broken down from larger rocks by the mechanical force of water and wind, and the chemical force of weathering, then transported by rivers and glaciers and ocean currents, and deposited wherever those transport mechanisms slow down enough for the particles to settle. Beaches and dunes and seafloors, in that view, are simply the endpoints of an unimaginably long and slow sorting process. Now, that account is not false in its broad outlines. Silica is overwhelmingly abundant. Rock does break down. Rivers do carry sediment to the sea. Beaches do accumulate sand through these processes. But the truth is, there are aspects of the distribution and character of sand on Earth that the standard account explains less comfortably than its defenders usually admit. The first issue is uniformity. Sand from beaches on opposite sides of the Earth, beaches separated by oceans and continents and by radically different geological histories, is still remarkably similar in its basic character. The particle size distribution, the roundness of the grains, the mineral composition dominated by quartz. These features remain strikingly consistent across environments that, if the standard model is entirely sufficient, should reflect wildly different source histories and produce much more varied sediment compositions. The standard explanation is that quartz is chemically stable and physically hard, so it survives the sorting and weathering processes that destroy other minerals. Over time, quartz remains as the dominant residual mineral wherever sand accumulates. That explanation is internally consistent, but really, it also asks you to accept that the sorting processes of geological time are so thorough and so consistent that they produce essentially the same end product almost everywhere on Earth, even when they begin with radically different materials in radically different places. Researchers in the Tartarian tradition ask whether there is a simpler explanation. If the sand was produced all at once from the same kind of source material, then that uniformity would not need to be explained away. It would be exactly what you would expect. The second anomaly is scale, the sheer quantity of sand on Earth. The total mass of sand in the world's deserts, beaches, seafloors, and sedimentary deposits is so immense that the known processes of rock weathering and erosion, operating at documented rates even across geological time, struggle to account for all of it. Geologists have known for decades that the sediment budget of Earth's ocean basins implies deposition rates that, in some periods, exceed what the documented erosion of continental rocks could have supplied. Various solutions have been proposed: recycling of sediment through subduction and re-exposure, changes in erosion rates during glacial periods, other adjustments inside the model, but none of these explanations is considered fully satisfactory by every worker in the field. And that matters, because the Tartarian researchers who focus on this question point to the sediment budget problem as evidence that the standard geological account may be missing a major source of silica. And they argue that the missing source is not geological at all. It is biological. That brings us to the most important and least familiar part of the argument: what plants do with silica, and what that means for the geological record. Living plants absorb silicic acid from groundwater and deposit it in their tissues as amorphous silica, a form of silica that is chemically and physically distinct from the crystalline quartz of geological origin. This amorphous silica is called phytoliths, from the Greek words for plant and stone. Phytoliths form when silicic acid, absorbed through the roots, is transported into different parts of the plant and deposited inside specific cells and tissues. The result is microscopic silica structures that take on the shape of the plant cells where they formed. When a plant dies and the organic tissue decays, the phytoliths remain behind as microscopic silica particles in the soil. Over time, they accumulate in the soil, and eventually, they enter the sediment record. This is not speculative. It is thoroughly documented. Paleobotanists and geologists use phytolith assemblages to reconstruct past vegetation cover in ancient soils, because the phytoliths of different plant species have distinctive shapes that can be identified under a microscope. The scale of phytolith production in living ecosystems is significant. Dense grasslands and forests produce measurable quantities of phytoliths that build up in soil over decades and centuries. The contribution of biological silica to the overall silica budget of Earth's soils and sediments is recognized by geologists, although it is often treated as secondary to geological silica production. But really, this is exactly where the Tartarian researchers push the argument much further than mainstream geology is comfortable going. They argue that if the Earth, within the past few thousand years, was covered by forests of a kind and scale that no longer exist, then the amount of biological silica those ecosystems could have produced might have been sufficient to explain the sand budget anomaly itself. In that view, what we call geological silica, the quartz sand of beaches and deserts, may not be geological in origin to the extent people assume. It may instead be the transformed remnant of biological silica, once locked inside the tissues of living organisms on a scale now difficult to imagine. And this, precisely here, is where the argument begins to turn toward the trees. This is where the most radical and most contested claims in the Tartarian research tradition begin to concentrate. There is a category of claim inside that community, associated most prominently with a researcher presenting under the name autodidactic, and with the broader mud flood community, that the large rocky formations we call mountains are not geological formations at all. They are the remnants of trees. More specifically, they are described as the stumps and root systems and collapsed trunks of trees on a scale that has no living analog in the present world. Trees so large that their stumps, now petrified or silicified through centuries of exposure, are what we identify as mesa formations, as mountain peaks. As the flat-topped formations spread across the landscapes of the American Southwest, of Central Asia, of the Sahara, and of desert regions across the Earth. If you have never encountered this claim before, the first reaction is almost always the same. It sounds absurd. Mountains are not tree stumps. And really, that reaction is understandable, because the geological record of mountain formation is one of the most thoroughly developed areas of Earth science. Plate tectonic mechanisms explain how mountains form. Radiometric dates exist for the rocks that compose them. Structural geology explains folded strata, faulted layers, uplift, and erosion. This body of evidence is internally consistent and externally validated, and it does not depend on any assumption about a biological origin. That is true, and it has to be acknowledged clearly. But the Tartarian claim, at least in its more specific form, is not that all mountains are tree stumps. It is a narrower claim aimed at a particular kind of formation: the flat-topped plateau, the mesa, the butte, especially those in desert and semi-arid regions where a harder upper layer rests on softer material below. The claim is that these formations, which standard geology explains as remnants of horizontally bedded sedimentary rock layers where the softer surrounding rock eroded away and left harder caprock exposed, display characteristics that may be more consistent with biological origin than with purely geological origin. The researchers who make this argument point to several specific features. One is silica content. In some mesa formations, the silica concentration is extraordinarily high, higher than they believe would be expected from ordinary sedimentary processes in the environments where those formations occur. They also point to internal structure. Under certain lighting conditions and in certain exposed cross-sections, some formations appear to show patterns of layering and texture that resemble growth rings and vascular organization in very large woody plants. And then there is the surrounding landscape itself. In some locations, they argue that what appear to be root structures radiate outward from the base of these formations. Drainage patterns and soil structures seem to spread away from them in a manner that, in their interpretation, is more consistent with an ancient root system than with random erosion alone. Now, here is what makes the argument difficult to dismiss with a wave of the hand. The silicification of wood is a thoroughly documented process. Petrified wood, wood replaced by silica through the slow infiltration of silicic acid from groundwater as the organic tissue decays, is found on every continent. Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona contains the best-known examples in North America. But major petrified wood deposits also exist in Patagonia, in the Sahara of Egypt, in Thailand, in New Zealand, and in Antarctica. What matters is not just that petrified wood exists, it is how detailed the preservation can be. The preservation of wood structure in petrified specimens can be so exact that the cell walls of individual plant cells are still identifiable under a microscope. In some cases, the species of tree can even be determined from the anatomical structure preserved in silica. In other words, silicification produces silica that retains the structural information of its biological origin. The resulting silica is chemically similar to geological silica, but physically distinct at the microscopic level because it preserves the shapes of the cells it replaced. Over geological time, that structural information can be gradually erased as the amorphous silica recrystallizes into crystalline quartz, a process that proceeds slowly at surface temperatures. In recently petrified wood, The biological structure is clear. In very old, petrified wood, much of that detail may be gone. And that is exactly where the Tartarian argument presses harder. Researchers who claim that certain geological formations are the remains of very large ancient trees point to locations where what they interpret as biological structure, cell-like patterning, growth ring-like layering, is still visible in the rock. They then argue that the immense scale of the formations, combined with visible biological patterning and unusually high silica content, indicates that these are not ordinary sedimentary formations, but the silicified remains of organisms. Mainstream geologists reject this interpretation. The hexagonal columnar jointing, seen in some basalt formations, which Tartarian researchers sometimes present as evidence of biological structure, is in standard geology, a well-understood physical phenomenon created by the contraction of cooling lava. It has nothing to do with biological organization. The layering visible in sedimentary rock is explained as the result of successive depositional events, not growth rings. The high silica content of certain formations is explained by silica-rich source rock or by hydrothermal circulation of silica-rich fluids. These explanations are not arbitrary. They are supported by substantial evidence and by the internal consistency of the larger geological framework into which they fit. Anyone engaging seriously with the Tartarian claim has to admit that mainstream geology offers well-developed alternatives, and that the burden of proof rests firmly on the alternative interpretation. But acknowledging that burden is not the same as refusing to look at the questions. And the questions, really, do remain. Consider the global distribution of petrified wood. Significant deposits are found in Antarctica, a continent now covered in ice, and supporting no vegetation beyond primitive mosses and lichens in limited exposed coastal zones. Mainstream geology explains this by saying, Antarctica once sat at a different latitude as part of the supercontinent Gondwana and supported forested environments before plate movement carried it southward. Paleomagnetic evidence is used to date that movement to tens of millions of years ago, within the standard geological timescale that is coherent. But the Tartarian researchers focus on what that explanation requires you to accept. Antarctica had forests. Those forests were then transported to the South Pole and frozen over on a timescale completely beyond human memory and entirely dependent on geological models, rather than on any direct historical account. If you accept the standard geological time frame, that is unremarkable. If you question that time frame, the same evidence becomes available for another interpretation. That is why researchers in this tradition, who are skeptical of radiometric dating and of the established geological timescale, argue that the forests of Antarctica may have been destroyed far more recently than the consensus claims. In their framework, the petrified wood is not evidence of an ancient supercontinent, but of a recent and catastrophic deforestation event. This is not a small challenge. The geological timescale is one of the most extensively validated constructs in all of science, supported by radiometric dating, stratigraphy, paleomagnetism, and even the orbital mechanics of the solar system. To question it is to question one of the deepest foundations of modern Earth science. But within the internal logic of the Tartarian model, that challenge is necessary. If a global catastrophe resets civilization and produced the sand and sediment that now cover the geological record, then dating methods that assume long, continuous deposition would, in that view, need recalibration against a catastrophic discontinuity. The question they ask is not whether radiometric dating works technically, but whether its baseline assumptions are secure against the possibility of a recent catastrophic event that could have affected isotope distributions in ways standard calibration does not include. And once that possibility is admitted, even as a question, the next step in the framework becomes inevitable. The argument moves from stone and trees to mud. Now let us turn to the mud flood. The mud flood theory, one of the foundational elements of Tartarian research, holds that at some point in the relatively recent past, Probably within the last several hundred years, a catastrophic event buried a large portion of a prior civilization beneath a layer of mud and sediment. The evidence most often cited for this event is photographic and architectural. 19th century photographs, especially from European cities and from American cities in their early documented period, show buildings with ground floors partially or completely below street level. Windows that appear as though they should sit at ground floor height are instead at or below the present grade. Doorways open onto stairways descending beneath the modern pavement. Entire floors of what look like multi-story buildings lie underground, accessible only by going down below the current surface. The mainstream explanation for this phenomenon, and it is a real and documented feature of many older cities, is gradual accretion of street levels over time. Debris accumulates. Street grades are raised for drainage. New surfaces are built over old ones in the normal course of urban development. In most cases, that explanation is considered satisfactory. But the Tartarian researchers argue that there are examples where the scale of burial looks too great to fit a slow, local process. In some 19th century photographs, the degree to which first floors sit below grade implies burial of 1 meter or more. And in places where no clear street-raising program is documented, they see that as evidence of something more abrupt. What they find especially striking is the apparent uniformity. The burial depth, visible across photographs from cities in different countries and under different geological conditions, seems, in their reading, more consistent with a single event than with many unrelated local processes. And this is where the mud flood theory connects directly to the sand theory. The key question becomes the nature of the material that did the burying. If the burial event involved a flood of silica-rich material, a combination of water and dissolved or suspended silica released through the destruction of a prior biosphere, then the material settling out of that flood would be precisely the fine-grained silica sediment now spread across the geological record. The mud is the sand. The sand is the mud. The same material that buried cities would, in this framework, be the same material that now forms the beaches. This is speculative, clearly, but really, it is internally consistent in a way that demands attention rather than instant dismissal. The Tartarian researchers who describe a mud flood are, in effect, proposing a global-scale version of something that is well documented at local scales. Silica-rich sediment does not always sit passively as a geological deposit. Under the right conditions of water saturation and disturbance, sedimentary materials can move catastrophically, just as documented examples of liquefaction and landslides show at regional scale. From there, the argument expands again, back to the forests. Because the hypothesis of an ancient global forest forces you to ask what the world looked like before the industrial and agricultural transformations of the past 3 centuries. Satellite imagery and aerial photography, the tools that let us map global vegetation patterns with confidence, have existed for only a few decades. Before that, our picture of global forest cover depended on historical accounts, botanical surveys, and inferences from surviving remnants and the paleobotanical record. And what that record shows is that the Earth, even as recently as the beginning of the current era, supported substantially more forest cover than it does today. Deforestation through human agriculture and industry has removed enormous areas of woodland over the past several thousand years. The tropical forests of West Africa, the forests that once covered Europe from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains, the forests of the eastern United States, the great forests of China and Southeast Asia. All of these have been reduced significantly during documented history. But the Tartarian tradition proposes something more extreme than that. It claims there was a prior forest cover of a kind and scale no historical or paleobotanical record can fully recover, because the catastrophic event that ended it also disrupted the normal mechanisms of botanical preservation that would have left evidence behind. In that account, the forest was not slowly cleared over centuries of agriculture. It was destroyed in a single event, or a sequence of closely related events. and that destruction itself was the reset that cleared the ground for the civilization now called historical. The sand on every beach is, in this framework, the physical legacy of that clearing. The silicon dioxide, once locked inside the living tissues of a global forest, produced through the biological accumulation of silica in trees and grasses and vegetation on a planetary scale, was released all at once by catastrophic destruction, then processed by water and heat into the fine particles that now cover ocean floors, coastlines, and deserts across the contemporary world. This is why the sand is uniform. This is why it is everywhere. This is why the sediment budget of the ocean basins appears larger than the documented erosion of continental rocks can comfortably explain. This is why petrified wood is found in Antarctica and in deserts across the Earth, and in places where the current climate cannot support forests. This is why 19th century photographs show buildings buried to their first floors in silica-rich sediment. This is why the geological record appears to contain a discontinuity between what came before and what came after. A discontinuity that the standard timescale attributes to geological processes unfolding over millions of years, but that the Tartarian framework attributes to a single catastrophic event within human memory. These, then, are the questions raised by the sand hypothesis. They are not answers. They are questions. Questions that resist easy dismissal once you understand the internal logic of the system that produces them. The most honest response is neither immediate belief nor reflex rejection. The Tartarian sand hypothesis asks you to question fundamental assumptions about geological time, about the biological contribution to silica deposition, and about the completeness and reliability of the historical record itself. It asks you to leave open the possibility that something of enormous significance happened to this planet within the span of human civilization and was systematically excluded from the official account of geological and human history. At the same time, really, it also requires honesty in the other direction. However seriously one takes this possibility, it is still supported primarily by interpretive evidence, by anomalies, by patterns, by perceived gaps in the mainstream account, rather than by direct positive proof of the mechanism being proposed. The sand on every beach is made of silica. Silica is produced by both geological and biological processes. The biological contribution to the Earth's silica budget is documented and substantial. A catastrophic event of the kind described in the Tartarian framework would explain certain anomalies in that record. Whether such an event actually occurred is something the present state of evidence cannot definitively answer. What the evidence can say is that the question is worth asking, that the anomalies are real, that the mainstream account has gaps its own practitioners acknowledge, even if they propose very different solutions from those advanced in the Tartarian framework, and that the physical world around you, the sand between your toes, the mountains on the horizon, the flat-topped mesas of desert landscapes, is not quite as obviously the product of one simple and straightforward geological history as people are often taught to assume. Pick up another handful of sand. Hold it in your palm. Look at it. Ask what it is, not what you have been told it is. Ask what it actually is when you look with clear eyes and allow yourself to follow the questions the official account was never designed to generate. That is where this investigation begins, and it does not end with sand. If this is the kind of deep questioning of the physical record of the planet that speaks to you, leave your view below, give the piece your support, and stay with the next investigation. Because the Earth's surface is covered in evidence. The real question is whether we are reading it correctly.